The night was thick with fog, swallowing the world around Lucas as he approached the entrance to the old loom factory. The building stood at the edge of town, a forgotten relic of a long-gone era, its windows shattered and walls stained with decades of decay. The iron gates creaked as he pushed them open, their rusted hinges groaning like a dying animal. The factory loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged and broken against the starless sky, as if the very structure itself was a scar on the earth. A cold wind blew through the surrounding trees, carrying with it an unnatural silence, a silence so deep that even the insects seemed afraid to break it. Lucas hesitated, feeling an oppressive weight in the air, as if the darkness itself was watching, waiting for him to make the first move. He stepped inside, his flashlight flickering to life, casting long ghostly shadows on the crumbling walls. The interior of the factory was worse than he had imagined. Rows of looms sat silently in the vast open room, their wooden frames covered in dust and cobwebs. Yet, despite the stillness, Lucas felt as if he wasn't alone. The silence was thick, unnatural, as though the factory itself was holding its breath. Every creak of the floor beneath his feet echoed through the cavernous space, amplifying his sense of isolation. He scanned the room, and for a split second, he thought he saw movement in the far corner, a shadow that flickered out of sight just as his light touched it. His heart skipped a beat. He told himself it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The air inside was heavy, almost suffocating, filled with the scent of mold and rusted metal. Lucas could hear the faintest of whispers, so soft they were barely there, like voices trapped just beyond the walls, trying to break through. His pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He moved deeper into the factory, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. The looms stood like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it again, a flash of movement. This time, it wasn't a trick of the light. A figure, dark and indistinct, darted between the machines, disappearing into the shadows. Lucas froze, his breath catching in his throat. Fear coiled around his spine like a serpent, tightening with each second. He took a step back, his flashlight flickering wildly as if the battery was about to die. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, though he still couldn't make out the words. Panic began to bubble in his chest. He wasn't alone. Something was here with him, watching him, stalking him. He could feel its eyes on him, cold and predatory. The silence was no longer empty. It was alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy that pressed in on him from all sides. Lucas swallowed hard, trying to calm his racing heart, but the terror gnawed at him. He needed to leave. Now. But as he turned to go, the heavy metal door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound echoing through the factory like a gunshot. Lucas spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room, but there was no one there. The shadows, however, seemed to shift, growing darker, more solid. The temperature dropped sharply, and his breath came out in visible puffs of steam. The factory was alive, and it didn't want him to leave. Lucas's hands trembled as he pressed his back against the cold, damp wall of the factory. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The slamming door, the shifting shadows, it didn't make sense. But beneath the immediate fear, something else gnawed at him, a sense of déjà vu, a familiarity that he couldn't shake. He had been here before, but that was impossible. This factory had been abandoned for decades. His grandmother's stories about this place, told in hushed tones when he was just a child, began to surface in his mind. She had worked in a loom factory just like this one, but surely it couldn't be the same place? She had spoken of dark days, of accidents that left the workers maimed or dead, and of strange occurrences that no one dared to speak of too loudly. Lucas had dismissed her tales as the ramblings of an old woman, until now. The further he walked into the factory, the more familiar it became. His footsteps echoed off the crumbling walls, but with each step, he felt an unseen presence, as though the very air around him was alive, watching his every move. The shadows in the corners seemed to pulse, growing and shrinking like living entities, and the faint whispers continued, more distinct now but still unintelligible. His mind raced through the fog of his memories, trying to latch onto something concrete. And then his flashlight beam landed on something that stopped him in his tracks, a small dusty object lying on the floor, half buried in grime. A child's toy. Lucas knelt, his heart pounding in his ears, and wiped the dust away. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the toy, his hands shaking. It was a small stuffed bear, its fur matted and worn, one glass eye missing. He knew this toy. It was his. He had lost it when he was 5 years old, during a visit to his grandmother's factory, and had never seen it again. But how was it here? The question gnawed at his mind, filling him with a sense of dread that went beyond the fear of the supernatural. This was no coincidence. Someone, had placed it here, knowing he would find it. A sharp pain suddenly shot through his leg, causing him to gasp. He looked down, confused, and saw that the old scar on his calf, a scar he had gotten as a child, though he could never remember how, was throbbing violently. The skin around it had turned a deep, sickly red, and it felt as though something was pulsing beneath the surface, writhing just below the skin. Lucas's breathing grew ragged as panic set in. The factory wasn't just a haunted place, it was connected to him, to his past, in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The whispers grew louder, and this time, they were unmistakable. Lucas. His name, spoken in a voice that sent ice-cold terror down his spine. He whipped around, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. The shadows, however, seemed to swell, creeping closer, as if the factory itself was drawing him deeper into its grip. Lucas stumbled backward, his mind racing through memories long buried. His grandmother had once told him something about the looms, about how they were cursed, about the workers who had disappeared, and about the things that still lurked in the factory. He had laughed it off then, but now, standing in the very place she had described, he realized the truth in her words. And then it hit him. The scar. He hadn't fallen as a child, as he had always been told. Something had happened here, something terrible. His grandmother had tried to protect him, to bury the past, but the factory hadn't forgotten. It was drawing him back, calling him to finish what had been started all those years ago. Lucas looked at the toy again, its one remaining eye staring back at him, almost accusingly. His heart pounded in his chest as the walls seemed to close in around him. Whatever had happened here all those years ago was coming back for him. And this time, there would be no escape. The whispers were everywhere now, slithering through the darkness, filling the air with an eerie hum that gnawed at Lucas's sanity. His flashlight was dimming, flickering like a dying heartbeat, and every shadow seemed to pulse with life, shifting and coiling in ways that defied logic. He could feel the factory pressing in on him, its decaying walls thick with unseen horrors. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one harder to catch than the last. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind, threatening to pull him under. He needed to get out, but the door remained stubbornly sealed, as though the building itself was mocking him, daring him to try. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, crushing in its intensity. Lucas stood frozen, his pulse pounding in his ears. And then, from deep within the factory, a figure emerged. It was barely visible at first, a shadow among shadows, but as it drew closer, the outline of a woman became clear. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and sunken, and her form seemed to shimmer, as if she were caught between this world and something far more sinister. She wore an old, tattered dress, the fabric frayed and stained as though it had seen the passage of many years. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. He recognized her. It was his grandmother, yet not. This was not the woman who had raised him, who had told him stories by the fire. This was something else, something darker, wearing her face like a mask. She did not speak, but her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that chilled him to the core. In her hands, she held a small worn box. Lucas's chest tightened as memory surfaced. He had seen this box before, hidden away in his grandmother's attic. She had always forbidden him from opening it, saying it held things better left forgotten. Now, as she extended it toward him, he felt a terrible weight settle over him. He didn't want to take it, but something deep within him knew that he had no choice. His hand trembled as he reached for the box. The moment his fingers touched the cold wood, a shock of pain surged through him, nearly bringing him to his knees. His grandmother's face twisted into something grotesque, her mouth stretching impossibly wide as a guttural whisper filled the air. "You must choose, Lucas." Her voice was like nails scraping across his mind, each word laced with malice. The box creaked open, revealing its contents: a small withered lock of hair, tied with a faded ribbon, and an old photograph of a young boy. Lucas's stomach churned. It was him as a child, standing in front of the factory with his grandmother. But there was something wrong with the picture. The shadows behind them seemed alive, twisting into unnatural shapes, their tendrils creeping toward the child in the photo. He felt bile rise in his throat as the memory, long buried, rushed back. He hadn't just visited the factory as a child, he had been here before, and something had happened. Something terrible. "You can leave, Lucas," his grandmother's voice crooned, her eyes gleaming with malice. "But only if you give me what I need." She gestured toward the box, and Lucas felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a vice. He realized with a sickening clarity what she was asking of him. She wanted him to sacrifice a memory, a precious piece of his past, something that defined who he was. The lock of hair, tied with care, was the last remnant of his mother, who had died when he was young. His grandmother had raised him after that, but now it was clear that she had known more about his mother's death than she had ever let on. Terror coursed through him as the reality of the situation settled in. If he gave up the memory of his mother, he would be free, but at what cost? Would he still be himself without that part of him? Could he live with the knowledge that he had traded the love and warmth of his mother's memory for survival? On the other hand, if he refused, the darkness that surrounded him would consume him entirely, trapping him in the factory's malevolent grasp forever. He would become just another shadow, another whisper in the walls. His hand hovered over the lock of hair, his mind a whirlwind of fear and indecision. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls dripping with a darkness that pulsed with hunger. His grandmother's face twisted into a grotesque grin, her eyes narrowing in anticipation. Time was running out. He could feel the factory breathing, its malevolent presence pressing against him, demanding that he make his choice. And then, a thought pierced through the haze of terror. What if this wasn't real? What if the factory was manipulating him, bending his mind to force him into a decision that wasn't his to make? But even as he thought it, doubt gnawed at him. The pain in his leg, the scar that had mysteriously reappeared, it all pointed to something far more real than he wanted to admit. Lucas's heart raced as he stood at the crossroads, the weight of the decision threatening to crush him. To let go of his mother's memory, to sever the last tie to the woman who had given him life, or to face whatever horrors awaited him in the factory's endless, suffocating darkness? Either choice would change him forever, but only one would let him walk away. With a deep breath, Lucas made his decision. The moment Lucas made his decision, the factory seemed to react as though it had been waiting all along. The shadows, once passive and drifting at the edges of his vision, now surged forward with a terrifying urgency, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. The air became thick, almost syrupy, and his every breath felt like a struggle. The oppressive silence returned, more deafening than before, and the temperature plummeted. His breath escaped in shallow, visible puffs, mingling with the damp staleness that clung to the factory walls. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum in the suffocating quiet. The looms, long silent, began to stir. At first it was barely noticeable, a faint creak here, a slight groan there, but then one by one they began to hum with life. The wooden frames moved of their own accord, the ancient threads tugged by invisible hands. The rhythmic clack of the machines echoed through the vast space, eerie and hollow, as if the ghosts of long-dead workers had returned to resume their labor. Lucas stood frozen, watching in horror as the looms began to operate, weaving threads that weren't there, their movements unnatural and jerky, like puppets controlled by unseen forces. Then came the whispers. They slithered out from the walls, wrapping around him like invisible tendrils. "Lucas." The voice was faint, barely a breath, but unmistakably real. He turned sharply, his flashlight sweeping through the room, but there was no one there. Yet, the voice persisted, growing louder, multiplying, until it was a chorus of murmurs filling every corner of the factory. "Lucas, you shouldn't be here." The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, disorienting him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but deep down, he knew the truth. The factory wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it wanted him to stay. The shadows on the walls began to move in ways that defied logic. They no longer followed the beams of his flashlight, instead twisting and writhing as if they had a will of their own. Shapes emerged from the darkness, figures vague and indistinct, their outlines flickering like a weak flame in the wind. Some appeared to be workers, their heads bent low, hands moving in rhythm with the looms. Others were more monstrous, their bodies elongated and distorted, moving in unnatural, jerking motions that made Lucas's skin crawl. The whispers grew louder, and the figures seemed to take on a more defined form, stepping closer, edging toward him. Lucas backed away, his foot catching on a broken piece of machinery. He stumbled but caught himself before falling. His flashlight flickered violently, casting erratic beams of light across the room. For a brief moment, the beam landed on something that made his heart stop, a face, pale and gaunt, peering at him from between two looms. The eyes were hollow, black pits, but the expression was unmistakably one of torment. Before he could react, the figure dissolved into the shadows once again, leaving him paralyzed with fear. The whispers intensified, becoming more frantic, more demanding. "Leave now, before it's too late." But Lucas knew there was no leaving, not without consequences. The factory had him now, and it wasn't going to let him go without taking something from him. He could feel its grip tightening, the very walls closing in as though they were alive, breathing, pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but every path seemed blocked by the growing presence of the shadows, by the voices that clawed at his sanity. Suddenly, the machinery erupted into life. The looms rattled and clanged with a deafening roar, their wooden frames shaking violently as if possessed by some unseen force. The floor trembled beneath his feet, and Lucas staggered backward, barely able to keep his balance. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of voices overlapping and drowning each other out. "It's too late. You can't leave. It's coming." The words cut through him like shards of ice, each one sending a new wave of terror coursing through his veins. Lucas's hands shook as he clutched the flashlight, its beam barely holding against the overwhelming darkness. He could feel something behind him, a presence so strong it was almost physical. Slowly, he turned, the air around him growing colder with each movement. His light flickered and then, for the briefest of moments, revealed a figure standing just a few feet away. It was his grandmother, or at least, it wore her face. Her eyes were empty, black voids that stared into him, devoid of any warmth or recognition. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, lips parting to reveal teeth that were far too sharp, far too numerous. "Stay," she whispered, her voice a grotesque mimicry of the gentle tone he remembered from his childhood. "Stay with us, Lucas. Forever." Panic surged through him, and he backed away, but the factory was alive now, its walls and machines closing in, leaving him nowhere to run. The shadows reached out, grasping at him with tendrils of darkness that coiled around his arms, his legs, pulling him closer to the machines, to the whispers. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence that now filled the room once more. The factory wanted him. The shadows wanted him. And Lucas realized, with a sinking dread, that he had already made his choice. The air was suffocating, thick with the stench of mold, oil, and something far more sinister that Lucas couldn't name. His vision blurred as terror clawed at his senses, warping the reality around him. The shadows in the factory seemed to pulse with a dark energy, growing larger, more solid, as if feeding off his fear. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. His mind was unraveling, tethered to reality by a fragile thread that threatened to snap at any moment. Every sound, the creaking of the old machinery, the whispers that echoed through the walls, became louder, more insistent, until they filled every corner of his mind, drowning out his rational thoughts. Lucas blinked, trying to focus, but his eyes betrayed him. The looms, once old and rusted, now spun with life, their gears grinding as threads of black silk stretched across them, woven by invisible hands. The figures he had seen in the shadows were no longer just fleeting shapes, they were becoming clearer, more defined, and they were watching him. Their faces were twisted in grotesque mockeries of human expression, eyes hollow, mouths hanging open in silent screams. The longer Lucas stared, the more he realized that the figures were not strangers. They were reflections of his worst fears, his darkest nightmares brought to life. Each one represented a fragment of his past, moments of pain, regret, and loss, now twisted into something monstrous. The ground beneath him shifted, as if the factory itself were alive, reacting to his growing terror. His pulse pounded in his ears, and he could hear the blood rushing through his veins, louder than the whispers that surrounded him. Lucas stumbled forward, trying to escape the gaze of the figures, but his feet dragged against the floor, as though he were walking through thick mud. His legs trembled, his heart raced, and for the first time, he truly felt the factory pulling at him, not just physically but mentally. It wanted more than his presence. It wanted his fear, his despair. The walls seemed to close in, and the figures pressed closer. Lucas's vision distorted, and he saw flashes of horrific images. His grandmother, screaming in agony as shadowy hands pulled her into the abyss. His childhood home, burning to the ground while he stood helpless in the street. His mother, her face contorted in pain, reaching out for him from the darkness, begging him to save her. He could smell the burning wood, the thick smoke choking the air, and the searing heat on his skin. But it wasn't real. None of it was real. Or was it? The factory's hold on his mind grew tighter, weaving a web of terror that blurred the lines between past, present, and nightmare. Lucas stumbled into one of the old looms, his hands clutching the cold, rusted metal as he tried to steady himself. His breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, but no matter how much air he pulled in, it never seemed to be enough. The walls around him swirled, the faces of the figures warping, their eyes black pits of nothingness, reflecting his growing madness. Then came the visions. Flickering at the edges of his sight, they invaded his mind. Flashes of a life he didn't recognize, memories that weren't his, but felt as real as the ground beneath his feet. He saw a man, standing in front of a mirror, his reflection distorted, his face slowly peeling away to reveal something darker, something monstrous beneath. He saw children running through a field, their laughter turning to screams as they were swallowed by the shadows that stretched across the sky like tendrils of a living nightmare. A voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear, rising above the whispers. "Give in, Lucas." It was his own voice, but twisted darker, filled with a malice he didn't recognize. "Let the fear take you. It's easier that way." The temptation was there, gnawing at the edges of his mind. It would be so simple to give in, to let the fear consume him. The weight of his memories, of the terror that filled every corner of his mind, was too much to bear. He could feel himself slipping, the factory's hold tightening with every breath, every heartbeat. But as the shadows pressed closer, as the figures moved in, Lucas remembered something his grandmother had once said. Fear was a weapon, but only if you let it be. It was the factory's weapon, its way of breaking those who wandered inside. But what if he refused? What if, instead of giving in to the terror, he embraced it? His pulse steadied, if only for a moment, and the darkness recoiled ever so slightly, as though sensing his resistance. The faces in the shadows faltered, their forms flickering like a bad signal on a television screen. The whispers grew quieter, more uncertain, and the grip of the factory's oppressive energy loosened just enough for Lucas to take a breath that wasn't tainted by dread. But the temptation remained, the lure of surrender pulling at him. The factory wasn't finished with him yet, and deep down, he knew the battle for his sanity had only just begun. The oppressive darkness seemed to tighten around Lucas as he ventured deeper into the heart of the factory. The whispers had quieted, but the silence that replaced them was far worse, thick and suffocating, like the calm before a storm. His every step echoed in the vast, decaying space, bouncing off the crumbling walls as if the factory itself were mocking him. The shadows moved in unnatural ways, twisting and bending as though they were alive, waiting for him to slip, to make a mistake. His heart pounded in his chest, a drumbeat of fear that grew louder with every step, but Lucas forced himself forward, driven by the knowledge that whatever was happening here, whatever force had taken hold of the factory, was tied to him. He needed to confront it, no matter the cost. Ahead, in the dim glow of his fading flashlight, he saw a door, one he hadn't noticed before. It was old, made of splintered wood, with iron hinges that were rusted and worn, as though it had been untouched for decades. But something about it called to him, a silent pull that tugged at the deepest corners of his mind. Lucas hesitated, the cold air pressing in around him, but he knew there was no turning back now. The factory had lured him to this point for a reason, and the answer lay beyond that door. With trembling hands, he pushed the door open, the wood groaning in protest. The room beyond was smaller than the others, more confined, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper that must have once been vibrant but now hung in faded strips, revealing the cold stone underneath. At the center of the room stood a single loom, larger and more elaborate than the others he had seen. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, but even through the decay, Lucas could see that this was no ordinary machine. The loom seemed to pulse with a life of its own, threads of dark, shimmering silk stretching across it, twisting and turning in intricate patterns that hurt his eyes to look at for too long. And there, standing beside it, was his grandmother. Or at least, something that looked like her. Her figure was hazy, her features shifting in and out of focus, as if she were caught between two realities. Her eyes were hollow, black as the void, and her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Lucas's heart clenched in his chest. He knew it wasn't really her, couldn't be, but the sight of her filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread and sadness. This wasn't just about the factory. It was about his past, about the secrets that had been buried, and now they were clawing their way to the surface. "You've come so far, Lucas," the voice that wasn't quite hers whispered, echoing through the small room. "But now, you must see the truth." The loom began to move, its wooden arms creaking as they spun the dark threads, weaving something into existence. The air grew colder, and Lucas's breath misted in front of him as he watched in horror. The threads took shape, forming a tapestry, and as the image became clear, Lucas felt the ground shift beneath him. It was a scene from his childhood, his mother, standing in a field, holding his hand. He was no more than 5 years old, his face lit with joy as he ran through the tall grass, unaware of the shadows that loomed just behind him. But the tapestry twisted. The shadows in the image grew darker, more defined, and suddenly, the scene wasn't one of happiness but of terror. His mother's face changed, her smile fading, her eyes widening with fear. The shadows reached out, wrapping around her, pulling her into the darkness as Lucas stood frozen, unable to help. The memory crashed over him like a wave, the truth he had buried so deep finally surfacing. He hadn't just lost his mother, she had been taken, swallowed by the very darkness that now filled this cursed place. The loom stopped, and the room grew deathly still. His grandmother's voice, cold and empty, filled the silence. "You have always been part of this, Lucas. The factory took her, and now it wants you." Lucas's mind raced, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The factory had claimed his mother, and now it was coming for him. But why? Why had it waited all these years, only to draw him back now? The questions twisted in his mind, but there was no time for answers. The room grew darker, the shadows lengthening as they crawled toward him. His grandmother, or the thing that wore her face, stepped closer, her black eyes gleaming with malice. "You can stop this," she whispered. "But you must make a choice." Lucas swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. The factory had brought him here for a reason, and now it demanded payment. He could feel it in the air, the way the walls seemed to close in, suffocating him with the enormity of the decision. He had two options, and neither was without consequence. He could leave now, abandon the factory and the ghosts that haunted it, but to do so meant losing the last fragments of his mother, forever trapped in this place. Or he could stay, confront the darkness, and risk everything, including his sanity, in the hopes of freeing her and perhaps himself. The shadows crept closer, their cold fingers brushing against his skin, and Lucas knew the time had come. The factory wouldn't wait forever. He had to decide. "Choose, Lucas," the voice hissed, its tone filled with a terrible finality. His heart raced, his breath shallow as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The darkness pulsed, hungry, waiting. And in that instant, Lucas understood, the factory wasn't just a place. It was alive, feeding on fear, on pain, on the broken souls that wandered into its grasp. It had taken his mother, and now it wanted him. But Lucas wasn't a child anymore. He wouldn't let the factory win. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, into the darkness, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. The moment of truth had come. The darkness swallowed Lucas as he stepped forward, the air around him thickening with an almost tangible weight. The factory had become a living entity, its walls pulsating with a sinister rhythm, as if the entire structure was breathing, waiting. The once familiar creaking of the looms had morphed into a discordant symphony, their sounds blending into guttural whispers that clawed at his sanity. The figures in the shadows, now fully formed, watched him from the corners of the room, their hollow eyes gleaming with anticipation. Lucas could feel their gaze, cold and predatory, as if they were waiting for him to break, to give in to the terror that gnawed at his mind. But Lucas wasn't going to break. Not now. The figure of his grandmother still stood near the loom, her ghostly form flickering like a bad signal on an old television. Her face twisted into a grotesque smile, but there was no warmth in her expression, only malice. The air around her shimmered with an unnatural energy, distorting the space as though reality itself was unraveling. She stepped closer, her feet barely touching the ground, gliding toward him with an eerie grace. Her voice, when it came, was a soft whisper, yet it echoed loudly in the confined space. "It's time, Lucas," she said, her words dripping with venom. "You've come so far, but now, you must give me what I need." The loom behind her clattered violently, its wooden arms spinning faster, the threads weaving an intricate web of darkness. The tapestry that had once shown a twisted version of Lucas's childhood now displayed something far more horrifying, a faceless figure, standing at the edge of a deep, endless void. It was him. Lucas knew it, even without a face. The figure stood alone, surrounded by shadows, its form slowly being pulled into the abyss. The message was clear, this was his fate unless he submitted to the factory's will. "Give in, and the pain will stop," his grandmother's voice continued, though it wasn't her anymore. The creature that wore her face was something far older, far darker, and it wanted him to surrender, to let the factory consume him just as it had consumed so many others before. "You'll be free of this place, free of the past." All you need to do is let go. Lucas felt the pull of the darkness, the seductive lure of release. It would be so easy. Just give in, let the factory take him, and all the fear, all the torment would end. The weight of his memories, the guilt, the pain, it would all dissolve into the shadows, leaving him in a numb, eternal silence. But something deep inside him resisted. He had spent his entire life running from the past, from the nightmares that had haunted him since his mother disappeared. Now he stood at the edge of the truth, and he realized he couldn't walk away. "I won't let you have me," Lucas said, his voice stronger than he expected. The creature's smile faded, replaced by a sneer of anger. The shadows in the room shifted, tightening their grip around him, pressing in like a vice. The air grew colder, and Lucas felt a bone-deep chill settle in his chest, as though the very life was being drained from him. His vision blurred, the edges of the room darkening, and the whispers became screams, deafening and chaotic. "You think you can fight this?" the creature snarled, its form flickering violently. "You think you're strong enough to face what's coming? You're just a boy, Lucas, a scared little boy who's lost everything." The words cut deep, but Lucas held his ground. He had lost so much, his mother, his childhood, his sense of safety. But he wasn't that scared little boy anymore. He had come here to confront the truth, and now, standing on the edge of oblivion, he finally understood. The factory had never just been about fear. It was about control, manipulating memories, twisting reality to feed on the darkness within. It had taken his mother, broken her, just as it had done to countless others. But it wouldn't take him. With a surge of defiance, Lucas lunged toward the loom, his hand reaching out to grab the dark threads that bound him to this place. The creature screamed, its form distorting as it lashed out, the shadows flaring with a blinding intensity. Lucas felt the searing cold of its touch as it tried to stop him, but he pushed through the pain, his fingers closing around the threads. The moment his skin touched the fabric, a shockwave of energy exploded through the room. The shadows recoiled, the whispers silenced. The loom, once spinning furiously, came to a screeching halt, its wooden arms splintering as the dark threads unraveled. The creature let out a deafening wail, its form flickering violently before collapsing into a swirling mass of darkness that dissolved into the air. Lucas staggered back, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was still now, the oppressive weight of the factory's presence lifted. The shadows that had once clung to the walls were gone, and for the first time since he had entered, the air felt lighter, almost normal. He looked down at his hand, still clutching the dark thread, and realized what he had done. He had broken the cycle, severed the factory's hold on him, and on his mother. But as the silence settled, Lucas knew it wasn't over. The factory had been wounded, but not destroyed. Its darkness still lingered, deep within the walls, waiting for another victim, another soul to feed on. And though he had escaped, he carried the weight of that darkness with him. He could feel it, a lingering shadow at the edge of his mind, a reminder that the factory's curse was never truly lifted. As Lucas walked toward the door, the last remnants of the loom disintegrating behind him, he glanced over his shoulder one final time. The room was empty now, but the memory of what had happened here would never leave him. The factory had claimed his mother, and it had almost claimed him, but he had survived. For now. The door creaked open, and Lucas stepped out into the cold night air, leaving the factory behind. But as the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of a whisper, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the factory wasn't done with him yet. The night outside the factory was eerily still, the fog clinging to the ground like a living entity, wrapping around Lucas's legs as he walked away. He had escaped, but the victory felt hollow. The factory loomed behind him, silent once more, its dark silhouette against the night sky a constant reminder of the horrors within. Lucas's body was heavy with exhaustion, his mind still reeling from the confrontation. His hands trembled, and though the cold air bit at his skin, the true chill came from within, an emptiness, a lingering presence that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Every step felt wrong, as if the factory's malevolent grip still reached for him, even as he left it behind. The whispers that had filled the air moments before had faded, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly gone. They were waiting, watching. He glanced back at the factory one last time, expecting to see the shadows crawling from the broken windows or the door creaking open as if inviting him back inside. But there was nothing. Just silence. Yet, the silence itself was unnerving, a quiet that felt too heavy, too unnatural. It was as if the building itself had gone to sleep, but not permanently. It was resting, waiting for the next soul to stumble into its grasp. As Lucas moved further away, The world around him seemed distorted, subtly wrong in ways he couldn't pinpoint. The trees, once familiar, now cast shadows that twisted in unnatural directions. The fog swirled around him, forming shapes that dissolved the moment he tried to focus on them. His thoughts raced, a gnawing suspicion taking root in his mind. Had he really escaped? Or was the factory still with him, playing tricks on his perception, twisting the reality around him as it had done inside? The weight of his decision hung over him like a storm cloud. He had severed the connection, broken the loom, but at what cost? His mother's fate still haunted him. The factory had taken her, consumed her in ways he still couldn't fully understand. And though he had survived, the truth of what happened to her remained hidden, lost in the shadows of the cursed machines. The thought gnawed at him, an unspoken fear that perhaps the factory wasn't done with him. Perhaps it had let him go too easily. The scar on his leg throbbed, sending a sharp pulse of pain up his body, as if the darkness from the factory was still inside him, festering like an infection. He stopped, wincing, and looked down. The scar, once faded, was now an angry red, its jagged lines almost glowing in the faint light of the moon. Lucas's heart raced. He touched the scar, half expecting to feel the cold, unnatural texture of the factory's shadows, but it was just his skin, normal yet not. The pain was real, but it wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something that lingered within him like a poison slowly spreading through his veins. Lucas's thoughts spiraled as he tried to piece together the fragments of what had happened. He had broken the factory's hold, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. The factory had reached into his past, twisted his memories, and now it felt like it had left a part of itself inside him, a seed of its darkness planted deep within his soul. He looked back again, half expecting to see the factory's doors swing open, but the building remained silent, its secrets buried beneath layers of time and shadow. But Lucas knew, deep down, that the mystery of the factory was far from over. The curse had been lifted, but not destroyed. The dark energy that had filled those halls, that had whispered through the looms, was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. He could feel it, like a cold hand gripping his heart. He knew it would call to him, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. The factory had marked him, and the darkness wouldn't let him go so easily. As Lucas walked further away, his thoughts turned to the others, those who had disappeared, the workers, his mother. What had truly happened to them? The factory had offered no answers, only more questions, more shadows. The truth was still out there, hidden in the darkness that clung to the factory's walls. He wondered if anyone else would ever find it, or if the factory would simply wait, biding its time until another unsuspecting soul stumbled inside, drawn by the same lure of curiosity and fear that had pulled him in. And then, just as he thought he was finally free, he heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper carried on the wind. Lucas. His blood ran cold, his breath catching in his throat. He stopped dead in his tracks, scanning the fog-covered landscape, but saw nothing. His heart pounded in his chest as the whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. Lucas. It was the same voice, the voice of the factory, the voice that had haunted him from the moment he stepped inside. But how could that be? He had escaped. He had broken the connection. Or had he? Fear settled into the pit of his stomach as the realization dawned on him. The factory wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, an ancient force that fed on fear, on pain, on the very essence of those who dared to enter. And though Lucas had left its walls, he hadn't left it behind. The factory was inside him now, its whispers embedded in his mind, its darkness flowing through his veins. The scar on his leg throbbed again, more violently this time, and Lucas knew the truth. He would never truly escape. The fog thickened, the shadows around him twisting once more, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Lucas. The factory wasn't done with him. It would never be done with him. It would haunt him, follow him, drag him back into its clutches when the time was right. Lucas stood there, frozen in place, the world around him silent but for the soft, relentless whispers. The mystery of the factory remained, its dark tendrils reaching out into the night, and Lucas knew that no matter how far he ran, no matter how long he fought, the factory would always be with him. Waiting, watching, whispering, and one day, it would call him back.